Today on CityCast DC, we've got the awkward politics of crime, the awkward logistics of a Beyonce concert, and it is vacation season, even at restaurants. CityCast's Julia Caron and Washingtonian's Jessica Sidman are here to round up the week. Today is Friday, August 11th. I'm Michael Schaefer, and here's what DC is talking about. Hey, Jess. Hey, Julia.
Hey, Mike.
Hey, Mike. Thanks for having me on.
All right. So there was a whole thing this week, a to-do, where D.C. council member Trayon White, he represents Ward 8, which is mostly across the river, southeast D.C., some of the poorest neighborhoods in Washington, some of the most crime-ridden neighborhoods in Washington. And we have, for those of you who don't know, it's been a really murderous beginning of August. It's terribly sad. Trayon came out and said, hey, we are in a war zone, and I want to call in the National Guard to help patrol the streets. Those words he used, we are in a war zone, were pointed in that the new police chief had said this is not a war zone. And, she wasn't denying this wave of murders. She was more, like, I think, speaking aspirationally, like, folks, come on, this isn't a war zone. But at any rate, this call for more bodies on the street is, like, kind of an interesting thing, and is going to be an issue going forward with the politics of crime. And I think crime, when it goes up, it just really injects like a dose of ugliness and paranoia into politics. We had it like 25 years ago, but it's sort of hard to remember. And I think that's what's going on here. The mayor has said, no, we're not going to call in the National Guard. We are trying to get more police. We're trying to recruit more police. They have, the number of police has trended downward. The police departments across the country have had trouble everywhere recruiting and retaining members. But this is actually a big change, because just a couple of years ago, the energy and the creativity in city politics seemed to be in like finding ways of not having as many police on the street, farming some of the tasks out, the mental health interventions and so on, to people who are not gun-carrying, uniformed officers. And we're in a kind of weird dynamic here where like the members who represent some of the neighborhoods where people are most hurt by crime and murder are asking for more law enforcement bodies at a time when the defund the police push is being increasingly caricatured as a thing of like elite progressives. I don't know. It's like a pretty wild moment, and I'm not quite sure how to read it.
Yeah, I don't either. I think my question to Mayor Bowser, and maybe to you, is like, one, like, what can they do to ensure that like police are actually keeping citizens safe? And then also, like, hypothetically, if they were to call in the National Guard, like, how would that be different? How would that work if they brought in the Guard? Like, what would they do differently?
Right. So the core competence of National Guarding, in case you don't know, is not urban policing.
Yeah, I was going to say.
And I think, like, looking at Trayon White's press conference, I think what he wants is just, like, bodies out there. And this is, like, a big piece of, like, urban safety theory. Just, like, the more eyes are on the street, whether those eyes belong to a cop or a National Guardsman or, like, a lady sitting on her porch who's going to, like, holler if somebody's misbehaving. These are, like, a good and safe thing. One of the frustrating things about this elevation of murders is that nobody, as best I can tell, has come up with a theory of the case. Like, why are more people killing each other? And they'll say, well, it's more guns. But, I mean, are there, is it easier to get a gun now than it was 4 years ago? And then I heard one case where a law enforcement person said, well, there's all these beefs, these, people having feud. Well, I mean, are people somehow more apt to beef with one another now than they were just a couple of years ago? I don't think anyone has quite figured out the why of it. I mean, there's like some specific things like carjackings seem to happen a lot to like DoorDash drivers. And so that's like an opportunity that didn't exist 10 years ago. But I think you kind of got to figure out the why to get to the what to do next.
It's interesting because we did an episode about youth violence in the city on the rise. And one of the theories that was postulated was like, because social media is much more prevalent, like a beef that happens on social media, you can take it out on someone on the street. Like you can find them, hit them up, and it escalates. And that's part of the reason why youth violence is at like basically a record high right now. So I do wonder if like at the adult level, that has something to do with it. I'm curious to see if there are solutions, because I do think that there is like a mental health component of where do we need police to actually be to help versus just like, let's insert another person with a gun, you know?
Wait, so Jess, you cover restaurants and dining in Washington. The high-profile murders and the high-profile incidents of gun violence and carjacking and stuff, that's not all, I mean, some of it's happening in high-traffic, high-density, gentrified neighborhoods full of pricey restaurants. Is this something that the owners and people who work in that industry are seeing as impinging on business at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one of those things you don't want to sensationalize it too much, but I definitely am hearing from restaurant owners all the time about the impact of crime. And I've heard numerous people say that it was affecting their business, especially, certain neighborhoods like H Street or even Columbia Heights, that whether there is an uptick or crime or not, there's 100% a perception that it might be a little dangerous, at least among certain groups. So some diners are hesitant to, go to certain neighborhoods. I think there have been a rash of burglaries and break-ins. It just is a weekly occurrence that you see some restaurant or bar post a photo on Instagram of a smashed window. And, I just don't remember that being the case a decade ago when I, started covering the dining scene. And now it's all the time.
Are they seeing it in depressing the amount of people coming out to eat?
I don't know that there are any actual, quantitative studies on this, but anecdotally, I have heard some restaurant owners talk about that.
Right.
But on top, there are also other reasons, like things are more expensive. There are other reasons people aren't going out. So it's hard to really figure out exactly what it is.
Right. And that's one of the things about what crime, like this sort of panic about crime does, is that it becomes a thing that sort of feeds on itself. There was a thing like in the 80s or 90s or something when Barry, who was the mayor then, he was quoted saying like, well, other than the murders, crime in DC is not that bad. And everybody laughed at him, right? Like, what a silly thing to say. But what he meant and was saying unartfully was that we were in the midst of a war over drug sales, and that the people involved in that war were engaging in tremendous acts of violence, often against each other, sometimes innocent bystanders. And that, like, by the standards of other crimes, rapes and armed robberies and whatever, DC was not any particularly different than anywhere else. And, I don't think anyone's got a theory of the case here, but there is this, like, anything you can say to try to tamp down hysteria over it also can look awfully insensitive to people who are, like, getting guns stuck in their face or being shot or something.
Mike, a little birdie told me that somebody recently had a birthday.
It is true. Although I thought you were going to say John Riggins and Barack Obama, both of whom share my birthday.
That's a good list of people to share birthdays with. So you, Barack Obama, and CityCast DC all have similar, if not the same, birthdays.
Right. So, and we are celebrating the CityCast anniversary, doing something live. On August 28th, we are both going to be there for a live anniversary taping and party.
I can't wait. It's all happening at Sunny's Pizza in Parkview. It's going to be an anniversary party and live taping. It starts at 5 p.m. and there's going to be a natural wine tasting by Plant Wines. Monday night, taping starts at 6:30, and it'll kind of be a nice fall foliage looking event. We're going to be talking about DC's fall fairs, so getting us ready for the cooler fall weather, which y'all know is my favorite season.
And we will be joined by Chelsea Ceruzzo, formerly of Axios, now my Politico colleague.
I can't wait. I'm excited to get to hang with you and celebrate both your birthday, CityCast DC's birthday, Barack Obama's birthday, all in one spot.
This episode is brought to you by Certified Piedmontese Beef. Listen up, foodies. Make your next meal even better with real Nebraska beef. They have healthy, tender, delicious Italian heritage beef, grass-fed and sustainably raised on lush pastures in the Midwest. You can even create your own personally curated meat box that's shipped right to your door. To get 2 free steaks with any purchase over $50, use the code FREEBEEF at checkout. Learn more and shop exclusively at cpbeef.com.
All right, so there was a Beyonce concert this week at FedEx Field, and that's usually not the sort of thing that our intensely news-focused Friday Roundup focuses on. But this Beyonce concert, as with many things at FedEx Field, led to some disasters and inconvenience. What happened, Julia?
Okay. So there were a couple of things that happened. As you might know, we've had some upticks in like pretty windy and violent winds and storms going on over the last couple of weeks. We know that like there have been trees down, they've taken power lines down, stuff like that. One of the storms hit FedEx Field out in Landover, and the way that it was managed by FedEx Field, I think, has kind of brought into question how the area is managed. So the way that they got news out to fans on Sunday, this is when the concert was happening, was via a tweet at like 6:40 p.m. that like, hey, you should shelter in place, stay in your cars, like don't come into the stadium. And people were already there. like people were already making their way into the stadium. And so I don't know how you like shelter in place in that regard. Do you like shelter like in the parking lot, like near a tree? Do you try to make your way inside the stadium and like hunker down that way? Do we think FedEx Field is stable enough to weather that kind of thing? Big questions that didn't really get a good answer. So people were pretty furious about that. There was one person who posted on Twitter, they're trying to shelter in place in FedEx Field, and they tweeted about the fact that like the shelter in place had 50,000 people waiting in a hallway at FedEx Field, and it was super duper hot because you've got all these bodies like clustered together and there's no way for the heat to escape. So that was a thing that is like pretty problematic. And then like it continues to rain at like 10:20 p.m. There's like massive rains, massive winds. The show continues to be on hold. Like eventually Beyonce takes the stage. And like as someone who has seen Beyonce, I can tell you it is definitely worth seeing her. But I don't know that I would put up with like 70, 80 mile an hour winds and like huddling and turtling for warmth in the rafters of FedEx Field to try and see her. And basically FedEx Field is trying to figure out what the heck happened at this. So like their spokeswoman, Jean Medina, said the stadium is reevaluating its crowd control methods to try to get people moving in a certain direction so it's less chaotic. You know, like it's just, you know, it's just a mess. And so I don't know. What do you guys think? Would you try to shelter in place at FedEx Field during a storm, or not worth it to you?
How much were tickets for that show?
A lot.
You gotta, you know, if it was a Fugazi show and you only paid $5.
Yeah, exactly. This is like in a long list of like questionable-ish things about FedEx Field. Like we had an interview with Sam Fortier of the Washington Post about like, are the Washington Commanders going to try to finally like switch stadiums, because he literally rated it like one of the worst stadiums, if not the worst in the NFL. Like there have been other weird incidences. There was a railing that collapsed at FedEx Field. It gave way as the Philadelphia Eagles quarterback Jalen Hurts was like just trying to head into the locker room after the game. And like there were fans that like collapsed and stuff. There was also a questionable pipe burst, right? And there was maybe like feces and stuff on fans. Like it's just in a long line of questionable things about FedEx Field. I don't know.
So the cynic in me might suggest that this news was delightful to the new ownership group of the Washington Commanders.
Oh, I bet it
who
was.
Would very much like to leave FedEx Field and would also very much like to cause taxpayers somewhere to help them build a new facility. There's an argument that, dude, like FedEx Field's only like, I don't know, 25 years old or something. Like it's not, like these things are supposed to be built for like the ages. Like the Roman Coliseum is still there.
The Roman Coliseum, FedEx Field is not. I will put it lightly that way.
True that.
You know?
Right. But the point is, more bad news about FedEx Field may have an effect on something that's going to be, I think, a really big political issue in either in DC or in one of the other jurisdictions locally in the next couple of years. And this example, like, you know, I'm sure there's like social media images and stuff of people like squeezed against the barricades. It is terrible. And it could have been much worse. But the end result could help getting us to float bonds to build a stadium for a billionaire.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is one of those things where like, I'm thinking right now of all the people who want Taylor Swift to come to DC, and I wonder if one of the reasons is because like she knows FedEx Field is a bad place. If the new owners of the Commanders are like, oh my God, like if we need a 50,000 person stadium, 60,000 person stadium, if we can divert that money, sure, maybe it like is definitely for selfish interests, but it also could be just like, you know, a functioning outdoor stadium in the middle of the city, you know? I will say, outside of FedEx Field, Jessica, you got to break a like much more fun Beyonce story over the weekend at a place that I'm sure has more structural integrity than FedEx Field. What's it about?
Yeah, so while Beyonce was preparing for her big performance, her husband Jay-Z and sister Solange went to brunch, classic DC activity, and they went to a kind of unexpected restaurant, which is Opal in Chevy Chase.
Oh my God, I've been there.
Yeah, it's a relatively new restaurant. It's only a year old, serving, they call it coastal American cuisine. So it's a little under the radar. And the owner of the restaurant said he had no idea how they chose that particular restaurant, but they just showed up, no reservation. I guess if you're Jay-Z, you don't need a reservation.
I was going to say, you just walk up in and you're like, hello. And they're just like, they make a table appear for you magically, you know?
Exactly. And they apparently stayed a few hours, had a great time.
Right, how did people find out about this?
Oh, so Jay-Z offered to take a photo with the staff of the restaurant. The owner was saying, you know, usually they when they get some sort of a high profile guest, they would not, you know, promote it. They try to respect that person's privacy. But Jay-Z, I guess, was cool and was like, yeah, I'll take photos. So they posted it on social media and it was making the rounds.
And then you wrote about this and your traffic went nuts too.
People love brunch and they love Beyonce and Jay-Z. That's a watch.
Give the people what they want, man. Give the people what they want.
All right, well, it's right near me, so why don't we go to brunch sometime?
Deal.
Count me in.
Cool. All right, so you wrote a cool story. I mean, it's like a sort of a charming thing, this idea of restaurants that go on summer vacation, which seems very like European to me. In America, no one ever takes a break. What's the story?
Yeah, so I think traditionally there's this idea that restaurants, for the most part, are always open, right? You can count on them to be open year round. You can count on most of them to be open on holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, other days that, you know, maybe the rest of us traditionally have off. But more and more restaurants are saying, no, actually, you know what? We deserve a vacation too. We want a summer break. And especially coming out of the pandemic, when there was that forced break, I think was a wake-up call for a lot of people that, you know, these are humans who work here and they too need a breather. They need some time off. They need a paid vacation. So, yeah, more and more restaurants are taking an August break, and sometimes it's a week, sometimes it's 2 weeks, maybe even a little more. And it's that opportunity to just have a vacation like the rest of us.
I was going to say, is August, when it looks like a lot of these places are taking like a week-long break, is that like a slow season for restaurants? Because I imagine with like tourists and stuff, like obviously August might not be quite as popular, but it's right before people are going back to school. I would imagine that like coinciding with tourist season doesn't mean that they lose business. Do they time it so that it's more beneficial? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. August is famously a very slow time for the restaurant business. January as well. You know, obviously Congress is in recess. A lot of people go on vacation before school starts. And that's why you see promotions like Restaurant Week are often in August to kind of build up business in otherwise slow times. So it's good timing in terms of businesses can close down and not lose as much revenue as they would during a busier time of year.
But you also wrote about places that had shrunk the amount of vacation they took.
Yes.
Because it's in some neighborhoods, at least, it's a tough time in the industry.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's worth saying the reason the restaurants have to shut down is for a vacation is because there's not enough people in most restaurants for people to just be like going off and taking their individual vacations. If you want to give everyone a break, you're going to have to close down. The reality is a lot of businesses are still struggling coming out of the pandemic. I think there's this perception that everything's back to normal, but a lot of businesses have lingering debt. And so, I spoke to the owner of Brine, which is an oyster bar restaurant, which has locations on 8th Street and in DuPont. And he used to do a 2-week break for his staff. But this year, he said, I really can only afford to do 1 week. The margins are too slim. I just can't afford it.
Dang.
And it's also worth saying, usually these are paid vacations, and if you're salaried, it's fully paid. But for the most part, from the business owners I spoke to, they don't make up the tips that their tipped workers would make during that time. So the tipped workers will make minimum wage for the hours they would have worked, but a lot of servers, bartenders in DC make far more than that, and businesses aren't necessarily compensating them for those missed gratuities.
All right. So what are some places that I should not plan to be going to in the next month or so?
Yeah. Which of my favorites can I not frequent anymore?
I know like Oyster just came back, I think, from their vacation, although it's impossible to get a table there anyway.
Fair enough.
I think La Tejana, very popular breakfast taco joint in Mount Pleasant, they just started their 2-week vacation. Also in Mount Pleasant, Martha Deer is taking a summer break. On the higher end, places like Kinship and Viola taking summer breaks. So it's really a wide range of different kinds of restaurants. But if it's August, maybe just check their website ahead of time to make sure the restaurant is open.
All right, Jessica Stidman, I'm so glad you were not on a vacation this week. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Julia, always good to see you.
Thanks, Mike.
And that is all for today here on CityCast DC. Our lead producer is Priyanka Tilve. Our producer is Julia Karen. Our newsletter writer is Kayla Cote-Stemmerman. Our production assistant is Susanna Brown. And our hosts are Bridget Todd and me, Michael Schaefer from Politico. Music is by Alex Roldan. If you enjoyed the show, tell someone who eats out regularly. We'll be back Monday morning with more news from around the city. Bye.